All right, so who in here has heard about Swordfish? All right, we're good. So I don't need to talk at all, right? No. Okay. All right, we've started captioning all of the Swordfish stuff with cutesy titles because last year we were doing all intro to Swordfish and we got bored with them. So one of the things you'll see at SDC is we're actually looking at a whole day of storage management summit with panels and workshops, and we actually are planning, it will actually be our second Swordfish Plug Fest. We had our first Swordfish Plug Fest this week. Disclaimer, everything is subject to change. Everything I say today is subject to change. But our first Swordfish Plug Fest this week, so things are actually moving really fast with this. We only started, well, I think I've got the timeline in here, but this whole thing is actually moving really fast. We've started our first Plug Fest this week. We had 4 or 5 companies participate, and we're very excited at the pace things are going. So, anything you want to know, SNIA.org/swordfish. Jump off point for all information on this website. This is me. That was useful. Okay. Just kind of walk through kind of why Swordfish, what is it, who's working on it, how's the fishing, what's going on, and see what kind of questions you have on it. So we cover this one. If you've seen any of the presentations before, we kind of go through a little bit of background on, why are we doing this? For anybody who's had any exposure to this and have been around the industry a while, you probably know a lot of this already. But so storage management standards are something that it's pretty well. There's a pretty solid need for it. We've had SNIA for a long time, and it's actually of the server management standards versus storage management standards is actually a really fairly successful API, but it's really long in the tooth. It's very hard, very complex. And folks are starting to have given us a lot of feedback over the years about what can we do to make it simpler. We're with all of the new storage infrastructures, hyperconverged, newer technologies, folks have said, what can we do to adapt to that? And rather than trying to kind of drag SNIA forward, we basically said, okay, let's take some of the learnings from that. What are people asking for? And, kind of start fresh. So these were some of the learnings, right? Make it simpler to implement and consume, improve access efficiency. So fewer transactions, not 1,000 commands to do the thing that somebody's actually trying to do in one thing. Provide useful access with a standard browser, right? Anybody who's used SNIA, it requires a huge tool set to do. Expand coverage to include converged, hyperconverged, and hyperscale. So again, those new markets. And provide compatibility with standard DevOps environments. So we're moving away from where you had storage admins doing everything and really specialized skill sets to do everything. We still have that, but we're also getting a lot of environments where you got Joe, who knows just a little bit about storage that needs to go do stuff. And so we need to, accommodate him and also the tool sets that folks are used to using. So those were a lot of the requirements that we tried to bring in. And it turns out server management guys were doing the same thing. So we basically took a lot of things that were going on and said, okay, let's refactor and leverage a lot of what's going on with SNIA, which was driving a simplified model, which this is really, a lot more client-oriented, right? Let's not focus so much on what vendors want to do, but bring in, what do the clients want to do? And then move to a class of service-based provisioning and monitoring model. So I'll repeat that again. Move to a class of service-based provisioning and monitoring model. And then, of course, cover block file and object. And then cover those domains we just mentioned. And so the how, servers were already doing this. So one of the ways we accelerated the whole thing was starting with Redfish. So Redfish had a lot of those attributes we were looking for. It's REST-based, so it uses a JSON payload. It also incorporates an OData transport, an OData payload, which is, I won't go into too much detail, but OData was brought in by Microsoft and standard from Oasis. And so it provides a lot of direct integration into multiple clients. So you support, Redfish gives us basically support for direct REST clients as well as for OData clients. And so one of the things we've done here is we're not starting from scratch. We're leveraging everything in Redfish, and we're only adding the storage extensions. So I'll show what that looks like. Right here, in fact. So the Redfish model had about a year, well, it had about a year head start in the standard. It actually started in a consortium of about 5 companies. So they'd been working on it about a year before that. The basic hierarchy here is, for those that are, everybody should be reasonably familiar with a REST hierarchy. It starts with the /redfish/v1, and then it's kind of broken down in 3 hierarchies here. So all of your logical view on your systems here, this kind of shows a basic server here. So your logical system here, the chassis is really where most of your physical representation goes, and then manager comes down over here. For the most part, the Redfish view, the manager is a BMC. And sorry, I've been instructed as of like yesterday to not say BMC, but to use MC, a management controller. My bad. But so your management controller over here. And so what we're basically doing is saying, okay, we're just going to use that in its totality and extend it, because a lot of storage systems are built entirely out of servers. Some are built, exclusively like that. Some are componentized. So what we do is basically say, okay, we'll just add to that. So cleverly color-coded throughout the whole thing is the purple for SNIA. So what we basically did was we said, okay, these systems that I've already said are, sometimes we just use those directly, like a storage controller might be an actual server, or it might be, logically very similar. A external array one controller could look almost identical to a server, except for a couple of custom ASICs, for example. So this is a logical system. We take it, we extend it, we add a couple of things. So like this is going to have a lot of the same information. I mean, a controller, disks, connectors, fiber channel or NIC information, similarly to where the server would have a NIC. It's going to have these same relationships here. Manager down here, where this might be MC, we're actually going to just extend that and use that where we might have a plug-in management card. So it might have a little bit more functionality. And then up here is where it gets really interesting from a storage perspective and where we put all of our focus. And we add the block file and object, and we call this storage services. And so a storage system, depending on implementation, may have host, a large number of storage services. And so all of our focus is primarily up in that row. So who's working on this stuff? We thought this was kind of an interesting thing to show. And I will point out in the 3-4 weeks since I've updated this, there's actually been a couple of mergers and acquisitions, so it's already out of date. It's a ridiculous slide to try and keep updated. But this is kind of the interesting one from our perspective, is the number of companies that are actually working on both things. You can see, we got 15 companies that are working on both standards. And that's kind of a really key takeaway, honestly, here is that this is, and also some of the names that are driving some of these things too, so. Okay, so how's it going? We've been, one of the things that we really like to highlight here is, we started this stuff, we actually ran, because we picked up and started leveraging the Redfish spec, we went from 0 to first version of the spec out for Swordfish in 9 months. Can I point, that's a standard from 0 to version 1 in 9 months. We think that's pretty much a record. So where we are right now is doing some incremental releases, basically this year, waiting for implementation so we can validate the functionality we put in there. Like I said, we had our first plug fest this week. We have, and let me just talk about what was in that version of the spec. That was full block and file functionality implemented with class of service. There's a few things that weren't in there. Things like full performance metrics instrumentation and, what all event, full event message catalogs, things that we actually need to see some implementations before we can go back and get all the vendors to agree that what we want to have in there. But from a functionality perspective, that was a pretty complete spec especially for 9 months. What we expect to see right now is we've kind of went, I've kind of put the team into a little bit of a, let's slow down, let's get some initial implementations, at least some proof of concepts out. I've been holding off on letting a lot of new functionality come in until we can validate that those initial implementations are solid. But in the meantime, what we've been doing is things like these open source tools. So we are just in the process of releasing some extensions to the Redfish emulator to cover all the Swordfish functionality. We're also in the middle of development of a Swordfish web client, which will work against any Swordfish implementation. That should be done in 6 weeks, 8 weeks, hopefully. We've got an initial implementation that shows it'll basically do a traversal, a read-only traversal, and we're adding some ability to modify, basically. So we need to get that in, get it solid and working against something besides just the emulator. And then we're doing some sample dashboard integrations against systems as well, so that folks can kind of get an idea of how to use systems. So we've got a Power BI implementation, a dashboard that we'll release via open source as well. All of these will be available on GitHub, on SNIA GitHub repositories. The Datadog, we'll do a Datadog one that'll actually be released on the Datadog open source repositories as well. So those are things that we're working on driving the development of just in the open source space. We also found out that there's a company, I don't think they've announced it publicly, so I'm not going to say their name, a non-SNIA company that is also developing, that has developed a proof of concept implementation of a Swordfish provider and multiple clients and integrations that they intend to release via open source. That just popped up out of the blue like 2 weeks ago, sent me an email and said, hey, we developed this stuff. So they couldn't make the Plug Fest this week, but so there's a lot of interest in this. We talked to them at, I think, Microsoft Ignite last year, hadn't heard a word from them, and then got an email a couple, 3 weeks ago that said, hey, we developed this stuff, great. So we're, We're, there's a lot of, there's activity out there. We're excited to keep hearing about it, and in addition to the work that we know that's going on with our member companies. Okay, I also mentioned we have a Plugfest coming at SDC, and then we have some, a bunch of incremental functionality that we're getting ready to add over, as soon as we get these things validated. We're looking at expanding our fiber channel fabric and initiator coverage and making sure that's complete. We've got performance metrics up on deck. We've got some joint work on speccing out what we call profiles. It's not the same as SMIS profiles, but it's basically a way for a client to tell, what functionality is implemented. And we're working with some of our members who are clients to basically go through and say, to be able to very clearly specify what it is that they want to see. So we can, again, we want to be very client-centric. Yeah, so, that was my... So where do you guys have questions?
On your last point, so there'll be some bare minimums, I guess, and then an extensible set that other people could use themselves?
On profiles? Yeah, so what we're trying to do, we're trying to do a common profile definition with Redfish. And so what we actually want to do is have a common kind of storage client definition, although clients could come in and have their own. So what we're trying to do is say, here's what a storage client is asking for from an implementation. But if a client, if a client wanted to come in and say, here's my profile definition, they could definitely do their own. So, if they want to say, here's my bare minimum, or if they want to say, here's every, absolutely every property I want to have, they could do it either way. So they can come in and say, here's the bare minimum, or here's a really, really detailed list.
Would that apply also to products that have unusual architectures? Because some storage systems are, very different than a server. And so you're taking what is essentially a server spec and applying it to storage systems. But many storage systems just look totally different. How do you deal with that situation? I mean, how can you possibly come up with a spec for everything?
So that's where we kind of put the balance on, and the way I I balance between my company hat and my standards hat. So I'm having this conversation. I had this conversation with one of our vendors yesterday. I had this conversation when I go back to my own company about how our implementation should be handled. So if I try and map the functionality to what's in, that our products have to what's in the standard. One of the things we've done with the class of service implementation is actually there's a tremendous amount of functionality that's wrapped up in there. The other thing you have is you actually have a space in every schema, in every spot, to add OAM extensions.
Yeah, that's what I was going for.
Yeah, I was going for too.
They're built in everywhere. So, and our typical model is exactly the same as we've had in previous standards, to say any functionality you have that needs to be driven into the standard. I don't think we've got decided whether it's 2 or more or 3 or more, but 2 or more companies want to push a feature in and say, a property in and say, we want to see this in the standard, or 3 or more in, we want to see this in the standard. We'll have that as a general model. Right now, we're still building the thing, so it's probably just like one company at this point, but something's missing, put it in.
Positive aspect of having the OEM
One,
breakout.
as we're running through these initial definitions, we're finding, especially through these initial implementations, these proof of concepts that folks are doing, we're finding folks doing here's all my proprietary functions, I'm going to put them in the OAM, and as we review those, we're going, no, this actually maps up to here, or we missed this property, let's put it into the standard.
Would that require redevelopment on their part for anything that communicates with that?
Not in these initial implementations, because there's nobody using them yet. But this kind of is where you get to the balance, and this is also where we're going to see a transition, because with the class of service model, it's really a transition between using traditional controls and into the class of service. And so what we might see is actually folks trying to satisfy requirements for clients or vendors or partners that want to, that have a need to have a traditional control in their system, and they have to provide that, versus also trying to integrate with the class of service model. So I think that's going to be the bigger balance, because, I look at my product set and I can find ways to put everything in, but my OEMs are going to want to see some of our features and functionality directly exposed. So that's where I'm personally going to have to find a balance in the system. As we see, folks coming in with, we've been working through specific use cases and what we So we've had a couple of folks come in with a specific, with how do we address this specific use case, and we either have to come up with we have a user. Some of the materials we provide is one of them is a client-centered user's guide. And so in the user's guide, we will either add a use case that says, here is how you do this for this specific scenario, and this is how it would be mapped, or we add into a piece of documentation we're developing, which we call a practical guide, because it's not targeted strictly at implementers. Here's how this, here's how an implementation might structure that, or if we've completely missed the functionality, we add it in. So I think there's kind of 3 or 4 different ways. One is if it's completely missing from the spec, we have to add it to the spec. But in some ways, it's also a matter of taking that traditional functionality and saying, here's how it maps to class of service. So that was a really long answer to your question. So.
All right, well then follow on. If you have one of those extensions, if a company comes up with an extension, how is the standard software going to deal with that extension? Is it capable of reading that and dealing with it in some way? I guess you didn't write the software, so you wouldn't know, but I'm not sure how this spec would work.
Okay, yeah, so there's two different answers for that. One is every schema has a standard spot to put OEM extensions. And so REST clients, there's 2 different types of REST clients, right? So there's that DevOps guy who's just coming in, kind of manually navigating down through. He's going to be able to just see those OEM extensions. Somebody coming in programmatically will just see those things and can either,
You enumerate the list of available.
Yeah, if he doesn't know what they are, they can just ignore them. But they can also go out and the OEMs will publish their schemas that describe those things, and those clients can pick them up and start to work with them. And so those OEM, we have a standard spot on that all of the SNIA, the standard schemas will be published at DMTF.org. And we're publishing all of our schemas jointly on the DMTF.org site as well, so that it's just easier. Everyone can go find all the Redfish and Swordfish schemas at the same site. OEMs can actually also republish theirs there, or they can publish them on their own websites. So a client coming along programmatically can actually go out, look up the schema, and publish them automatically. So for I said we were doing this Swordfish web client earlier. One of the things that's going to be able to do is basically, it's just going to go, just like that DevOps guy, say, oh, I found this stuff, here it is. And it will just automatically display it. So kind of like, dumb Chrome web browser traversal. here's all the information out there. It doesn't care whether it has an OEM tag on it or is a SNIA schema. It can automatically just go up and say, where's that schema? It's published somewhere. I can go get that schema, display it, and tell you what the attributes are, and format it for you. So we don't care who built the schema, as long as we can get to the schema and display it. That's the way any application can work. We would prefer people work with us and map their stuff as much as possible to the standards. But we recognize that everyone's going to have some things that they want to put in their OEM's proprietary sections. So there's a mechanism to say, here's my schema, here's what's in it, so that, I'm pointing to you as the client over here, that, you as the client application developer over here can go pick those up and start to use them.
Timeline for seeing real product on the market coming from these vendors?
Good question. Timeline for products. No one has actually published a timeline for products yet, but I expect to see things next year, frankly, which I think is pretty good.
Yep.
So like I said, we had first version of the spec in September last year. We're seeing initial proof of concepts now and implementations. First Plug Fest this week. We'll have another one in September, and so I think we'll start to see product next year. And we'll frankly see product faster in Swordfish than Redfish did, because Redfish was having all hardware-based implementations, and Swordfish will be software-based, software-based.
Yes, you'll be able to run that on the regular management IP address or management Ethernet address, as opposed to having a BMC management controller plane.
Yeah. I mean, obviously people can build it both places, but I think we'll see more complete implementations, more fully functional than Redfish, but because people can run them in conjunction with their management software and build them
at the same place at the same time with the same code base with any luck.
Exactly. So I would expect to see some next year, even though no one has announced them yet. So, of course, that's all dependent on the whims of mergers and acquisitions and
budgets and resources.
But the first implementations, I think, are coming together better than folks expected. So, and we also, because this stuff is all REST-based, people's development is going.
Development cycle is pretty quick.
Yeah. Especially since, we've had a couple just pop up out of nowhere that we didn't know were happening. So it's like, oh, look, we have 2 more than we thought. So, we were excited to see, multiple implementations coming this week when we knew about, multiple implementations from one vendor, and then we had 2 more vendors pop up, and we're like, okay, great. So.
Especially